Thanks, Robin. Cheers. Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Wilshire Ebell Theatre. My name is Alex O'Connor. I think most of you don't care about that, though. You've paid your money instead to see perhaps the world's most well-known evolutionary biologist on what is probably his last ever US tour. So, I'm not really one for wasting time. Please help me in welcoming, especially if this man's work has done something for you, whether it be the selfish gene, the God delusion, through to now the genetic book of the dead, for what is the last time in this, the City of Angels, the world's most famous materialist, Professor Richard Dawkins. Professor Dawkins, your latest book, The Genetic Book of the Dead, tells us that animals, or at least their ancestral history, can be read like a book. What do you mean by that?
It's a very ambitious ambition. And it's something for the future. I believe, and I've said, that the animal is a book. It's a record, almost like a book, a record of the ancestral past, the ancestral natural selection pressures which have led to the animal being the way it is. I'd like to quote from Darwin, because that is part of my inspiration. He said, "It may be said that natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad, preserving and adding up all that is good, silently and insensibly working whenever and wherever opportunity offers. We see nothing of these slow changes in progress until the hand of time has marked the long lapse of ages, and then so imperfect is our view into long past geological ages that we only see that the forms of life are now different from what they formerly were." Natural selection is familiar. This is the way animals are. This is why animals and plants are the way that they are. I believe that modern animals, any animal you look at, carries signals from the past which tell us of the natural selection pressures which led to its being the way it is. Now, since these signals come from very different distances into the past, from very old to slightly less old and so on, the genetic book of the dead must be a palimpsest. A palimpsest is an ancient manuscript which is then overwritten, rubbed out or partially erased, and then written over, and then erased again, written over, because the genetic book of the dead is a record from a very large number of different periods from the past.
And some of the most obvious examples of this writing of evolutionary history onto an animal is probably camouflage. It's probably the most obvious way of explaining what you're talking about.
That's absolutely right. A camouflaged animal almost literally has a description of its environment on its back, or rather of its ancestral environment on its back, which probably is the present environment as well. The first illustration in the book is a desert lizard from the Mojave Desert, not far from here. And the lizard has more or less literally painted on its back a picture of small pebbles, small stones, and sand, which of course is why it merges into the desert, which is why you can't easily see it. Now, my thesis is that this is only the tip of the iceberg, that camouflage is the obvious, superficial way in which the animal is a description of ancestral worlds, in this case, the desert. But this must be true right the way through the animal, right the way through every bit of the animal, every detail of the interior of the animal, which is not obvious in the way that the outer skin is.
Those non-obvious examples are of interest to me because something really clicks when you consider that looking at one of these animals with camouflage, you can basically know what its location would have looked like were it living thousands of years ago. But as you say, that's quite an obvious example. How do we read this book, to use your analogy, when it comes to less visual things like genes, things like other kind of more minute qualities of an animal?
Yes, this is really an exercise for the future. I'm projecting into the future when a zoologist of the future will be able to do that. And whereas today we're pretty much limited to the external appearance of the animal, that's the tip of the iceberg. I'm trying to provoke biologists to think about the interior of the animal in the same sort of way. And there are chapters on convergent evolution, on divergent evolution. There are various chapters which I'm kind of feeling my way towards getting into the genetic book of the dead, but this really is a matter of an appeal to future scientists.
Is there anything currently in human beings that we can observe that gives us an indication of the ancestral environment that they evolved in? What are some examples of things that we can observe in humans today?
Well, I suppose the fact that we have back pain, which is an indication that we used to...
Some of us, anyway.
Many of us have back pain. Actually, I actually don't. I'm rather fortunate in this respect, but I know many people who do. And this is almost certainly because we were never made to walk, we were never meant to walk on our hind legs. We've only been walking on our hind legs for the last probably 4 million years or so. And so we are quadrupeds and our backbone is now protesting at being thrust into the upright position. So this is a signal from the past.
Yes.
A painful one.
I do sometimes have back pain, for what it's worth. It can feel like we've been walking for 4 million years sometimes. There are some interesting examples of what you might call evolutionary blunders of this kind. I think my favorite is the laryngeal nerve.
Yes. I suppose the backbone is one, but there are some much more spectacular examples than that. You mentioned the laryngeal nerve. This is a nerve, it's one of the cranial nerves. It's a branch of the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus, which starts in the brain, and the end organ is the larynx. But it doesn't go straight to the larynx, it goes down into the chest, loops its way around a big artery in the chest, and then goes straight back up again to the larynx. Now, I've assisted in the dissection of this nerve in a giraffe, and it's a very substantial detour. And would have been even bigger in a sauropod dinosaur, and with possibly adverse effects. Now, this is manifestly bad design. Any designer would have been sacked if they had wired up the nerve in this way. It's a historical accident. It comes from the fact that in our fish ancestors, many millions of years ago, the nerve went directly to, it wasn't the larynx, the fish don't have a larynx, it went directly to one of the gill arches. And in those days, the most direct route was south of that aorta. And then when the neck started to lengthen, when mammals, when land vertebrates started to elongate the neck, then the nerve, the detour, each slight increase in the detour, the marginal cost of each slight increase in the detour was so small that it wasn't worth, so to speak, it wasn't worth jumping it over that artery. The embryological cost, the cost of changing the embryology so that the nerve took a completely different route was greater than the marginal cost of each tiny little increment in the detour. Putting it another way, any individual... Hello? I didn't hear. Did you hear that?
See me after class, whoever that was. I think.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. It was probably a very profound observation, but I didn't get it. The marginal cost of each slight increase was very small, so that an individual that radically changed its embryology to jump the nerve over the artery would have suffered, would have probably died, compared to a rival individual which just increased the detour by a millimetre.
This is also why Richard Dawkins is banned from the local zoo. I'm interested in some of the more mysterious paintings on these animals. As far as I'm aware, we're not quite sure why zebras have black and white stripes in the way that they do.
That's right, and that's a very interesting question. I mean, on the face of it, they look very conspicuous, but actually, if you actually see them out on the plains of Africa, they don't look conspicuous. There are various theories for what that's all about, including bewildering insects that don't know what to do, where to bite. But I'm not sure that I believe that. I think they probably are rather well camouflaged from a distance.
But do you worry that this scientist of the future, SOF, as you abbreviate in the book, might run into blunders of this kind, thinking that, I mean, the idea is that we can look at an animal and not have to do any geology to work out the environment in which it evolved. If somebody looked at a zebra today, today, they might sort of think, well, maybe this animal grew up in some kind of strange, stripy world.
That's right. There's a serious danger of being sort of too clever by half and jumping to conclusions and not testing the ideas. Sometimes it's rather difficult to test them. And that is going to be a problem which SOF, the scientist of the future, will have to face, not to be too glib in jumping to a plausible conclusion.
Are there any other examples of these mysterious animal qualities that we don't really know why they are the way they are?
Probably, yes. I imagine the audience might suggest some.
None come to mind.
Yes. Do you have any ideas?
Oh, well, I don't know how any of this works.
Yes.
I have no idea.
I mean, it's not that difficult to say I'm completely baffled by why the animal has this particular quality, and it's tempting to say, oh, well, maybe God did it, or sort of thing, but I think a better response is, well, we don't know, and we need to work on it, and it probably might make a good PhD study.
Yeah, and things like that laryngeal nerve, sort of simultaneously good evidence of evolution and natural selection, and also evidence counting against proactive design.
Yes,
even really in the process.
When it's manifestly bad design like that, and another probable example is the vertebrate retina being back to front. The camera eye is obviously a very good design. The idea of having a dark chamber with a lens at the front and a real image being projected upside down onto a field of light-sensitive cells, a retina. Mollusks have a camera eye, and cephalopod mollusks, octopuses and squids, have a rather advanced camera eye, comparable to our own. And in their case, the light-sensitive cells, the nerves from those cells come off them backwards to the brain, as they should, as any good designer would have wired them up. Ours don't do that. Vertebrate retinas have the wires that lead from the light-sensitive cells coming from the front, getting in the way of the light. And the nerves go all over the retina, and then they dive through the retina in the so-called blind spot into the optic nerve. Once again, obvious bad design. The great German physiologist Helmholtz said that if he'd been presented with the vertebrate eye by an engineer, he would have sent it back.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people say that evolution by natural selection is consistent with something like intelligent design. It's just that this is the method that God chose to create these animals. But here you're undermining not just the end result, which is undeniably impressive, but the very method by which it came about.
Yes. Yes, well, God would not have produced such bad design as the laryngeal nerve. The other thing about that is that you can't help feeling that if this is the way God did it, why did he choose a way that made him unnecessary?
Maybe it's just that Christian humility, who knows? Yes, I do sometimes ask God. I don't often pray, but sometimes I do ask him about that back pain every now and again. Um, I'm interested in this. You mentioned convergent evolution. I know that recently you looked into a phenomenon called carcinization, I think is how you pronounce it. It's been described as L.A. Borradaile, the biologist, as, quote, the many attempts of nature to evolve a crab. It seems that in at least a great deal of cases, crabs keep cropping up as if there's something in the world which is pointing to crabs as the pinnacle of at least some forms of evolution.
Yes, this is a nice one. This is not in the book, by the way. The crustaceans are built like a train with trucks going all the way from front to back, segments, and each segment has pretty similar design, but it varies. In some primitive crustaceans, all the segments are the same except the front end and the back end. In something like a lobster or a crayfish, they're all different, but you can see that they're all basically the same kind of design. And they either have claws, or they have legs, or they have swimmerets in the abdomen. Crabs do a rather weird thing. They more or less dispense with the abdomen altogether, and they curl it up, and it's very small, and they curl it up underneath the main carapace. So they have truncated, they've shortened the basic design of a crustacean. And it looks as though this has happened many times, maybe half a dozen separate times. Crustaceans have converged upon the crab way of doing things. It's not that unusual. I mean, convergent evolution is fascinating, and there's a whole chapter on convergent evolution, and crabs is just one rather nice example.
Yeah, I think that the many attempts of nature to evolve a crab might have been putting it a bit dramatically. I've seen people quite scared that human beings are sort of inevitably going to evolve into crabs one day, but I think we can put that to bed.
That's putting it too strongly. You've got to start off as a crustacean if you want to become a crab.
Indeed.
I've just remembered that in H.G. Wells's Time Machine, the time traveler goes forward in time eventually, a long way forward, and the only creature he sees is giant crabs. So maybe
there's something in this. Are there any other interesting examples of convergent evolution? That is, animals independently seeming to converge on particular qualities?
Yes. Well, one nice one is pill bugs, wood lice, which are very familiar. If you see a wood lice, the chances are it's not a wood lice, it could very well be a millipede, because there are millipedes which have converged upon the wood louse way of life, and they look exactly the same as wood lice. You can only tell the difference I can only tell the difference if I turn them over, and then they have too many legs. But otherwise, they look exactly like wood lice, and they curl up into a ball just like pill bugs do. But I think the most spectacular examples, perhaps, are the Australian marsupial mammals. When the great southern continent of Gondwana broke up, and Africa and South America and Antarctica and Australia all went their separate ways, Australia was dealt a hand of marsupials. The only mammals there were marsupials. And so marsupials then diverged to produce a whole range of different types: carnivores and herbivores, large ones, small ones, digging ones, climbing ones, etc. And these parallel the same kinds of creatures that we have in the old world. So in Australia, there are marsupial dogs, or there were until they went extinct, thylacines, marsupial rabbits, marsupial moles, marsupial mice, etc. So any kind of trade, any kind of way of life you can think of in a mammal, you go to Australia and you find the same thing, but independently evolved, independently converging upon what we're familiar with. So a marsupial mole looks like a mole. It has the same way of life as a mole. It has digging claws. It crawls through the sand in the same sort of way as a mole does. The mole way of life, by the way, has converged at least 4 times, not just in Australia and and Europe and Eurasia. In Africa, there are so-called golden moles, which again are entirely independently converged upon the mole way of life.
Something you address in the book is a question that might actually also be helpful for the evolution skeptics that we've just learned are prominent in America, which is this question of, I mean, we can apply it specifically to something like camouflage. There are animals, for example, the owl butterfly, which seems to have these great big eyes that it can reveal on its back to scare off predators. It's extraordinary. Again, there are pictures in the book, I think, and you can look it up online. It's incredible to see these realistic eyes on the back of an animal, on the back of a butterfly. And a lot of people want to ask, how does this evolve? In the sense that to see an eye, it's quite a complex image. It has to have sort of a center and an outer, and it seems like if you just had like a small black circle, it wouldn't really do the trick of scaring away a predator who thinks it's an eye. And so it kind of seems like in order to work, it needs to be all there at once. So a skeptic might say, how does this property evolve in the first place?
That is a problem. The eyes are, I mean, we call them eyes. I think they do look like eyes, and they really do, don't they? They're not just circles. They have a sort of 3D quality that looks like eyes. It's not just moths and butterflies. There are other creatures that have the same thing. If you've read the books about Babar the elephant, you may remember that the elephants under Babar had a war against the rhinoceroses. And Babar won the war by getting a whole lot of elephants to stand with their backsides facing the rhinoceroses. He painted great big eyes on their backsides. It's called the Babar effect. It's been worked on by a man called David Blest, and it really does seem to scare predators. They probably don't actually think it is eyes, but something about the eye pattern is startling. You asked the question, how did it begin? I think that's the burden of your problem.
Yeah, would a half eye, would a black circle do the same trick?
I find that an easier to answer with respect to camouflage, something like a stick insect or a stick caterpillar, where once again, nowadays, when you see a stick caterpillar, it looks just like a stick in every detail. It's got leaf scars and buds and things on it. And you have to wonder, to answer, and Alex's question would be, at the beginning, before it became looking like a detailed stick, how did it manage to escape the attention of predators when it was only very slightly like a stick? And I think the answer probably is that, and this doesn't apply so well to the eye spots actually, the answer probably is that seeing conditions are not always very good. And so if a predator were to catch sight of, or you'll just sort of see this incipient stick out of the corner of its eye, or in a poor light, or from a distance, that would be enough to overlook it, because it would look like sufficiently like a stick to be overlooked. And then the final perfecting stages of the evolution, when you get the detailed resemblance to a stick, that would have been put together by full frontal vision in a good light, close up. I can't quite do that for the eye spots. It doesn't quite work for the eye spots, because we're talking about overlooking something rather than, in the case of the eye spots, we're talking about being scared by a sudden appearance. By the way, I think that I've put two very scary pictures in the book. I can't decide which is the more scary, involving eyes. One is an octopus. Octopuses can change their color instantaneously. They're unique in this. Octopus and squids and cuttlefish can change their appearance instantaneously. And so they can put on any pattern they like, and putting on eye spots is something they suddenly do. That's very scary. And then on the same page, we have a vulture which has a false head with false eyes. So it looks as though there is something about eyes, and I can't really easily put together the answer to your question about the original incipient
I think
stage
people
of-
often forget that we're talking about an extraordinarily long amount of time and marginal gains, essentially. And I mean, it could be specifically the eye shape which startles a predator, but as far as I'm aware, they can sort of suddenly reveal these eyes in a lot of cases.
Exactly what they do, yes.
Yes, and so I would imagine that any kind of sudden shift, sudden revealing of color might be enough to startle a predator. And I think it's easier to see how, rather than trying to imagine like an eye evolving from scratch, first maybe just a pattern of colors,
any bright pattern,
any change
Yes.
that will flash at them, which will scare them, and then it can slowly start sort of
That's right.
turning into an eye
So
that
many
way.
butterflies have rather drab pattern on the underside, and then so that when they're just sitting with their wings closed, they look drab and brown, and then they open their wings, and immediately you see a flash of bright color. And I suppose just a startle effect would do it.
Yeah, and so you wouldn't necessarily have to get from nothing to an eye. You could
Yes.
get from a sort of pattern of any sorts.
A bright pattern, yes.
Seems easier to imagine that maybe morphing
Yes,
into an
yeah.
eye. But I'm interested, since we're all about evidence here, when it comes to mysteries like this, well, how exactly does the eye shape evolve on the back of a butterfly? How do we go about trying to find an answer to this? I mean, it seems like maybe somebody could come up with an interesting idea that sounds like it makes sense, and we say, oh, that probably works. But is there any sort of test that we can, in principle, run on these kinds of questions?
I suppose you can look comparatively at some species which have rather less convincing eyes than others, and some of them will just have as you say, a color pattern with what you could perhaps discern as an eye. It is a fact, I think, that the vertebrate brain, certainly the human brain, likes to see eyes whenever it possibly can, and do you know the illusion of the hollow face illusion? It's the most striking illusion I know. Do you know this one? You have a hollow mask, just an ordinary mask. It could be of some celebrated or infamous politician.
Or both?
If you look at it solid side on, it obviously it looks like a solid face. If you turn it to the hollow side, it looks extraordinarily like a solid face, although it's actually hollow. And if you put it on a rotating turntable, so that it's going slowly round and round and round, as the solid side comes round, it just looks solid. And then when the hollow side comes into view, it suddenly clicks into place as an apparently solid face going backwards. And this is well understood. The human brain looks for faces whenever it can. It looks for eyes whenever it can. And it will make eyes. There's a crater formation on the moon. I think it's on the moon. It might be on Mars. No, I think it's on the moon.
The face of Mars.
Mars,
I think, yeah.
that's right. Okay, which looks like a face, and we tend to see faces even when they're not there. And so maybe it's exploiting that.
Like other animals might have a similar thing
Exactly.
when it comes to
Yes.
predators.
Yeah. We would expect other vertebrates to have the same illusion.
Yeah, I mean, it seems intuitively easy to imagine why human beings would evolve a tendency to see faces in things. But specifically, do we have a good idea of exactly why this quality of human beings evolved?
Well, I could make a guess. It's something to do with individual recognition. It is remarkable how no two of us look the same, or almost no two of us look the same, and identical twins do. But it is remarkable how much variation you can pack into a face.
Yeah.
There is a neurological condition, prosopagnosia, where people cannot recognize faces. It's a remarkable thing because they can see a nose, an eye, two eyes, and a mouth, and they know they're there. A chap can't recognize his own wife.
I wonder if people with that condition also are less prone to sort of, I suppose they can't see faces in in things in the way that other human beings do. Like if you see two drains and a line underneath it,
Yes,
immediately see a
I would
face.
expect
And
so.
I suppose that quality isn't there at all for
Yes.
that kind of person. It's interesting. Human beings now evolve in a very strange circumstance. I mean, one day we might be able to read this genetic book of the dead for human beings and get an idea of how we evolved, but it seems like now we live in a scenario of unnatural selection. We're not all just sort of facing the elements and allowing the weak to die and the strong to thrive. In many ways, society has flipped this on its head, and now we make proactive efforts to protect those who are more vulnerable to the elements. How do you suspect that this will change not only the evolutionary trajectory of human beings, but also the ability of future evolutionary historians to look at human beings and take a guess at their ancestry?
It's quite clear that we are feather-bedded in a big way from natural selection pressures. Natural selection is still going on, but in a very odd way. And the world in which we live is so much a cultural world. Is so much. Not only is it cultural, but it's changing at an extraordinary speed compared to biological evolution. And so if we try to look into the future and say what humans might look like in the distant future, it's really impossible to do that because the cultural changes are going to be so rapid compared to the rate at which biological evolution goes.
Of course.
That it would be very hard to predict.
It's interesting how human beings can flip natural selection on its head, at least in the short term. I mean, talking about people who go hunting, for example, whereas usually it would be the weaker animals that would die of starvation or a broken leg or something. Now human beings go out and they look for the biggest, strongest animals to kill. And so
never thought of that. Trophy hunters, isn't it?
Yes. And so there are many instances like that. Like you could imagine, for example, these incredible owl butterflies. Human beings evolve and they find them quite beautiful, and maybe they start hunting them and putting them in cases, and so you end up with an evolutionary pressure, if it goes on for long enough, to get rid of the eyes, because now you've got a bunch of people who want them.
This has been happening with elephants in Africa quite rapidly, because trophy hunters go for, and ivory hunters, of course, go for the big tuskers. So it looks as though tusks are shrinking for that reason. It's an interesting point.
And same thing can happen in fish populations with smaller fish slipping through the nets, and so there are less big fish, and you have this very strange way in which we're dealing with, I suppose you could call it unnatural selection, or even sometimes reverse natural selection. But presumably, I mean, you said it's happening rapidly in elephants. What does rapidly mean in an evolutionary context?
Well, over about a century, I think. The records from, I believe it's Uganda, looking at records of tuskers, and they're getting smaller.
Which is amazing to me, thinking about the length of time that's necessary for
evolution
amazing. On the grand scale. I'm surprised to hear it, in other words, that it's so quickly.
Especially since elephants are very slow reproducing.
Yes, Are there any other examples of sort of fast natural selection that we can see in action? Not necessarily this reverse unnatural selection I'm talking about, but just before our very eyes.
Yes. Well, before our very eyes is a bit of a tall order. There are the mosquitoes in the London Underground is one example. But a more biologically interesting one, I suppose, is the cichlid fish of Lake Victoria. All three of the great African lakes, Victoria, Tanganyika, and Malawi, have very large populations of cichlid fish, which appear to have evolved from one or two founder populations. In the case of Lake Victoria, we know that the lake is only about 100,000 years old, which is tiny by geological standards. And yet Lake Victoria has about 450 species of cichlid fish, which appear to have evolved during that period of 100,000 years. So that's about as fast as I know of a sort of major evolutionary change.
Yes, and those mosquitoes on the London Underground, of course, spending enough time there, have just evolved to stop talking to each other and get very impatient on escalators. Haven't we also seen this? There's something about butterflies or moths in the Industrial Revolution getting darker.
This is a well-known case. Since the Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries and 20th century, various animals have evolved darker coloration. This has been well worked out by Bernard Kettlewell in peppered moths, Biston betularia. And in rural areas to this day, the majority of these moths are pale colored, and they sit on bark and are well camouflaged on pale bark. In industrial areas, like in the region around Birmingham and Manchester, where the trees are blackened from smoke from industry, the moths are predominantly black or very, very dark, and they're well camouflaged there. And Kettlewell showed with experiments and observations that it's undoubtedly true that in the industrial areas, the pale-colored moths are selectively picked off by bird predators, and in the rural areas, the dark-colored moths are selectively picked off. So in a matter of a couple of 100 years, in industrial areas, we've seen an evolutionary change from light color to dark color.
Can you help us understand how this happens with the gene as the unit of selection for natural selection?
Well, in the case of industrial melanism, the genetics is well known, and it's a kind of textbook example of what happens. It is just a single gene change, and of course, to get interesting evolution, you've got to have longer than that.
Darwin was quite confused in his lifetime about how the genetics would work, given that he thought that there was a process of gene blending going on.
That's right. In Darwin's time, and up until the experiments of Gregor Mendel, the Austrian monk in the 19th century, everybody thought that inheritance was blending. They thought that each child was a kind of mixture, a blend, like mixing two liquids together of the parents. And Darwin was no exception. Well, almost. I can come on to that. And this gave Darwin a lot of grief because a hostile reviewer called Fleming Jenkin, hostile reviewer of The Origin of Species, said that natural selection would be impossible because the variation would disappear and any new mutation, which we didn't call it mutation in those days, any new variant which was advantageous would soon be swamped by this blending process. The example that Fleming Jenkin used was a horrible racist example, but you don't have to do it that way. Darwin was worried by this. And little did he know the solution to the problem was buried in a German journal, the work of Gregor Mendel. Darwin's German wasn't that great, and he never came across this paper. Mendel's work was unknown until after Darwin's death, and it was rediscovered in 1900 or so. And what Mendel showed is that genetics is digital. Genes are all or none. You either get a particular gene from your parent or you do not. You either pass it on to your child or you do not. They don't blend. They go intact from grandparent to parent to child to grandchild and so on. You either get a particular gene or you don't. They never mix. They never blend. Tantalizingly, Darwin was almost onto this. There's a letter from Darwin to Wallace, who was his co-discoverer of natural selection, in which Darwin describes experiments he did on peas, which is interesting because Mendel also worked on peas. And Darwin said in his letter to Wallace that he had crossed two varieties. I forget what they were, say white and purple. I can't remember what the colors were. And he got either white or purple either one color or the other, but not a blend. So Darwin was onto that in the particular case of these peas. And then he said something very revealing. He said, I do not consider this any more remarkable than the fact that when you cross, he didn't put it quite this way, when you cross a male and a female, you get male or female offspring. You don't get some intermediate. So in a way, what Mendel did, and what Darwin kind of almost did, was to spot that just as sex is not blending, when you cross a male and a female, you don't get a hermaphrodite. You get either a son or a daughter. If only he'd generalized that to genetics generally, when you cross anything with anything, you don't get a blend, you get one or the other. Then he would have been able to see through the Fleming-Jenkin problem. By the way, one of the reasons why it kind of looks blending sometimes is so-called polygenes, where you have lots of different small genes with small effects, which have a summation effect. They're all digital, they're all particulate in themselves, but because there are lots of them, it looks as though they are blending.
So, for example, something like skin color, which looks
skin
like it
color
really
is a very good example, where
blend.
if you cross black and white, you tend to get an intermediate, and that's because you've got a whole lot of separate polygenes, which in themselves are particulate, and having a summated effect.
You've got a helpful analogy for this: the difference between sort of taking some colored paint and mixing it together versus using sort of
Well, that's right.
beads.
If you take red and blue paint and mix them together, you get purple. And if you then mix purple with purple, you don't reconstruct red and blue. But in genetics, that's just what you do.
It's more like having a bunch of tiny little
Beads.
beads of different colors. And
Yes,
if you
that's what it is, and that's what Mendelian genetics is often expressed as. In the post-Watson and Crick era, we know that genetics is digital right down to its very detail. I mean, every gene is digital. But that was not known to Mendel, of course.
It's a little bit like how computer screens work in their color. There's no yellow in a lot of computer screens, I think. And
That's right. We've
make
just
it up
got
with a lot
these
of-
three different colors. I think it's red, blue, and green, and little pixels, red, blue, and green. And you make any color you like by differentially amplifying these three different colors.
Yeah, they're not blending them together. They're just sort of almost tricking the eye in a way. Who is this book aimed at? I mean, it's got a lot of dense evolutionary biology, but at the same time, it's fascinating for someone like me who has not.
It's
studied it
aimed
to
at the same audience as the selfish gene. It's aimed at both lay people and professional biologists. John Maynard Smith, when he was reviewing the selfish gene and the extended phenotype, he made an observation which I was very pleased about. He said this book is rather unusual in that it's aimed at both professional biologists and at lay people. And the same is true of the Genetic Book of the Dead.
And tell me about you describe it as sort of like the sting of the book, this idea of genes as a gigantic colony of symbiotic viruses.
I'm a little bit embarrassed about this. The selfish gene had a sting in the tail, which was the last chapter, which was about memes. And this one has a sting in the tail as well, which is the proposal that we should regard all our own genes as equivalent to a gigantic colony of cooperating viruses. And this is not quite as radical as it sounds. It does not mean that a whole lot of separate viruses came together and formed a sort of cooperative like that. What it does mean is the following. I think the important distinction between parasites and, well, the important way to classify parasites is those whose hope for the future, if I can be pardoned for using that phrase, hope for the future is to get into the next host via the gametes, via the eggs or sperms of the present host. That's longitudinal transmission of parasite to the next host. That's longitudinal. Or horizontal transmission, which is like being sneezed out or coughed out or spewed out into the water supply in the form of diarrhea and then imbibed. So these are horizontal parasites which aspire to get into the next generation via some means other than the gametes of the present host. So we have longitudinal versus horizontal transmission of parasites. Now, if you think about the ambitions of a longitudinal parasite, they will be identical to the ambitions of the genes of the present host, because they want the present host to be a successful reproducer. They want the present host to produce children containing them, containing these parasitic viruses or bacteria, let's say. So any influence that these longitudinal bacteria or viruses can have on the present host will be identical to the influence that the host's own genes have. They will want the present host to be a good survivor, to be sexually attractive in order to have offspring, to be a good parent, to be good at building nests. Everything that the own genes, the animal's own genes, aspire to will be the same as what the longitudinal parasites aspire to. And therefore, you can distinguish those own genes which are rebels. There are some that are actual rebels. There are some of our own genes which aspire to cheat the system. Segregation distorters, they're sometimes called. There are, as you know, normally in meiosis, when you make sperms, any gene has a 50% chance, any one of your diploid genotype has a 50% chance of getting into each sperm. That's a 50% lottery, it's fair. But there are segregation distorters. There are genes whose phenotypic effect is to bias the production of sperms so that they are more likely than 50% to get into a sperm. So they are cheating the system. They have a great selective advantage, but it's to the disadvantage of the organism. So these are examples of own genes which cheat the system. And then we have viruses and bacteria which are horizontally transmitted, which are sneezed out. And they don't care if the present host survives. They may, for all they care, it can die as long as they get passed on. So I'm making this distinction between longitudinal and horizontal transmission. The classic example of a longitudinal transmitted bacteria is mitochondria. These are, we now know that they are originally bacteria, but they are now vital to our survival. All our cells contain these tiny particles called mitochondria. They have their own genes, they have their own circular genome, like a bacterium. They are bacteria originally. And they pass through the egg, they pass down the female line via the egg, so that they, insofar as they have any effect, their genes have any effect on the host, it will be in the same direction as the host's own genes. So this leads me to this sort of slightly fanciful, sting-in-the-tail conclusion that we can regard our own genes as cooperating with each other to produce the body only because they have the same interest at heart, only because they have the same exit route from the present, let's call it host, the present individual, into the next generation. So they are a cooperative of would-be independent agents, and the only reason they're not independent, the only reason they work together in a collaborative way, which they do, is that they have the same route into the future. And therefore, we can think of them as equivalent to a gigantic colony of viruses.
You call this yeah, it's a helpful way of thinking about it. You call it the sting in the tail. Do you think this is controversial? Do you think it's upsetting?
Well, I think that virologists might think that it's not really what they would mean by a virus. I mean...
it's not nice to think that we're riddled with viruses either, I suppose.
Yes, I mean, actually, about 8% of our genome really is originally viral. But I'm not talking about that. I'm saying I'm generalizing it to the whole lot. So it's the sort of thing I do,
yeah, it's hardly the most upsetting thing that you've written for in your career. I mean, so much for having a sting in the tail of your books. I think that at least one of them was really just itself one big sting. I know that, and by the way, in about 10 minutes, we will be taking audience questions, so get thinking. A lot of people will probably want to ask about that other aspect of your career, which is, of course, religion, atheism, the God delusion. And you're so often accused of creating a vacuum. You turn a bunch of people into atheists, you create this vacuum that other ideas come into. And I know you've been asked that a bunch of times, and I imagine that you quite recoil at the accusation that that's what you're doing, because I've seen you answer before and say that, well, you're against all kinds of nonsense. It doesn't matter where the nonsense comes from, you're against it. The question I wanted to ask you was, even if you are still condemning the nonsense that comes to fill this void that is potentially created as people give up one religion for another, even if you still condemn that thing which fills its place, if we determine that that thing is worse, less preferable than, say, something like Christianity, which might have been there before, do you still feel any level of responsibility? Or do you think you can be indicted for those ideas, even if you personally think that they are nonsense?
This is an interesting thing, and I, as you say, I have often met it. I think you have two schools of thought. If you have two different kinds of nonsense, is it better to arm yourself with a weaker kind of nonsense against a stronger kind? Or is it better to be against all nonsense? And I'm of the latter school of thought, but I do sympathize in a way with, I think, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, before her recent conversion, sincere conversion, I suspect, to Christianity, I think she did go through a phase of regarding Christianity as a kind of armament against something worse, which is Islam. I sometimes quote Hilaire Belloc's couplet, "Always keep a hold of nurse for fear of finding something worse." And I think that's what may have motivated her originally to be sympathetic towards Christianity. I don't go down that route. I think that I believe in evidence-based truth, and so I think that all religions and all superstitions, and including much of what is now sometimes called wokeness, are equally reprehensible, and I'm against them all.
I'm not sure if it's easy to quantify which you are more suspicious of or more worried about in society, but I mean, it's easy enough to be against these ideas, but to be clear, I mean, if you could snap your fingers and tomorrow everybody in the United States became an atheist, would you do it?
Yes, I would. This was a question which was put to Christopher Hitchens, and he said no, because he loves arguing, I think. But I would say yes.
There's a clip, you can watch it online, of Christopher Hitchens talking about this, and he says, you know, if I were given the opportunity, he says he was asked, if I were given the opportunity, there's one person left. I could deconvert them. I wouldn't do it. And he says, of course he loves the argument, but he says in that car ride, it's with Doug Wilson in the back of a car, he says, but there is that, but it's not just that. There's just something about it. And he said, I said this to Richard Dawkins, and the look of incredulity that he gave me remains with me, as is what he said. I mean, wouldn't you be a little bit sort of sentimental? Wouldn't you want to sort of preserve it for its own sake as a cultural artifact? Would you really sort of take that last, probably not particularly influential...
I do value, and I've said this often, I do value Christian literature. I value the literary heritage that we have from the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer. You can't take your illusions in reading English literature if you don't know the Bible. And so I wouldn't wish people to be uneducated in the existence of religion. I do take exception to teaching children, this is what you believe because you are a Catholic or a Muslim, whatever it is. But I do think that children should be educated about religion.
There you have it, folks. Richard Dawkins says, read your Bible. Just after Christopher Hitchens died, an author called Larry Taunton wrote a book called The Faith of Christopher Hitchens, in which, I haven't read it, he claims that near the end of Christopher Hitchens' life, he maybe started to flirt with religio-spirituality in a way that might surprise some of his followers. It was a controversial volume. A lot of people came out and condemned it. I wonder perhaps what your thoughts are on that, but also, are you concerned that people might try to do something like that with you?
I have read it. I think it's a disgraceful book. It takes advantage of he took advantage of a long car journey he had with Christopher Hitchens, and I think Christopher was probably being polite and talking seriously to him about his religion, and I don't. People do the same thing with Darwin. You probably read there was a woman called Lady Hope who called on Darwin when he was very old and dying. Well, we'll say very old, younger than I am, but anyway. And she described how Darwin opened the Bible and there was a beautiful sort of sunlight on his hand. He said, look how wonderful it was. It's all lies. It was debunked by Darwin's son, Francis. There is a risk that religious apologists are so eager to get deathbed conversions that you have to watch it. I hereby, well, actually, Christopher said, I think himself said, that if anybody claims that I've had a deathbed conversion, you can be absolutely sure that I wasn't in my right mind when it's happened.
Now,
I will not have a deathbed conversion, I think.
We're approaching the question and answer period, ladies and gentlemen. There is going to be a microphone which will be placed just about here, and we're going to have people queuing along the front and up the side of the theatre, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Just before we do that, there's a question I wanted to ask you absent of the Q&A here, but maybe it will be instructive. What is, across your illustrious career, your least favorite question that you're most commonly asked?
I think it could be the free will question. I'm nearly always asked, do you think we have free will? And I usually resort to Christopher Hitchens' answer, do I have free will? I have no choice.
Yes, as a free will skeptic myself, I sometimes wish that Christopher Hitchens had at least a deathbed conversion on that particular point. I think it's time to go for Q&A. We're going to do about 30 minutes, and we're going to have you queuing up here. I think somebody's going to have a microphone. I don't know where it is or who's going to place it there. We're going to turn up the lights. If you want to come down and start queuing up, I think it's going to be right in the aisle here, but I'm not sure where the... Is it on the other side? It's down. Oh, I see it. Okay, I couldn't see. Now, we want to make sure that people have time to ask their questions. We want to make sure that we get to as many as possible. And so, we're going to request that the questions are as brief and pointed as possible, if possible punctuated with a question mark at the end of them. And also, the theatre is a little bit echoey, so we may not be able to hear you very well, and I might need to repeat your questions if that's the case. But try to speak as clearly as, and I suppose as slowly as possible. But with that, I think we can go to the first question.
Can we have the lights a bit brighter?
Perhaps that's as bright as they go.
I was recently talking to my uncle who lives in India, and he mentioned an article that he read, and the question is, I recently read an article about research which shows that Florida carpenter ants perform amputations on injured ants, and also that they do it only in case of thigh injuries and not lower leg injuries, as lower leg injuries have a very short window for successful amputations and survival.
Sorry, can you start
Sorry.
again, because I think we've just got sound out of these fancy monitors.
So my uncle was wondering, I recently read an article about research which shows that Florida carpenter ants perform amputations on injured ants, and also that they do it only in case of thigh injuries and not lower leg injuries, as lower leg injuries have a very short window for successful amputation and the survival rate is not great. How can evolution explain the emergence of such complex behaviors and learning in ants?
I don't think there's a particular problem with that, is there? I don't understand that ants cut off their legs, did you say?
Yes, they perform amputations for other members.
For other members. I don't know about this. This is a good example of what we were talking about earlier, where you don't necessarily understand it because you don't know enough about it, and it's a good PhD project. The use of the word amputation already is loaded. It suggests that it was done for surgical reasons, to benefit the ant whose legs were cut off. For all I know, they were eating them. I mean, I just don't know. I don't know enough about it. I think ants do remarkable things as social insects for the good of the colony, more strictly for the good of the genes of the queen. And I would need to know a lot more to know why they're doing it, what benefit it has to the colony. So I can't answer your question. Which is a good thing in a scientist, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah, please, don't bother to applaud. It's
that Christian humility again, I suppose.
My question is for both of you gentlemen. I've heard that the internet, well, the question involves epistemology. I heard that the internet has been compared to the Gutenberg printing press from several hundred years ago. Given that the internet has a propensity to allow people to spread nonsense and pseudoscientific thinking in as much as knowledge, do you believe that this analogy is accurate and how it affects our truth-seeking processes in the future with the advance of our technology?
Well, the analogy with the printing press is a good one, and when you say the fact that the internet can spread nonsense as well as sense, the same is true of the printing press, of course. The printing press has always spread nonsense as well as sense. So yes, I think it's a very good analogy, and as for what we can do about it, that's rather more difficult. I think one of the things that my foundation and the Centre for Inquiry tries to do is to spread critical thinking, thinking based upon evidence, and to try to instruct people in skeptical critical thinking. But it's a hard uphill struggle.
Well, I think perhaps one difference is the advent of manipulative algorithms in the case of social media, but I still think that the printing press is a good analogy. It might not be just a continuation of the same process, but it's a good analogy to try to get to the root of how revolutionary an idea that we're talking about. It is of a different kind because of the algorithmic process, but even then, the books that you would be able to read would be determined by things like the university you were in, what books it had in its library. Books were expensive, people didn't have a lot of them, and so there were still pressures in terms of what you were going to read that would be influenced by the friends you had that you could borrow books from, the university that you were studying in. There would still be some kind of process by which that would affect what you see and what you're able to read. Obviously completely unimaginably smaller than manipulative algorithms, but perhaps a difference of degree rather than kind, and still for that reason a useful analogy, if not an exact forerunner of what we're seeing.
I suppose you could emphasize the fact that the printing press has been subject to sort of editorial control, which the internet is not, to put it mildly.
By and large, yeah. But I think they are quite different, and they might be different in kind for that reason. So it's only a useful analogy up to a point, as all analogies probably are.
Hey, Richard. So you spent most of your career debunking the God delusion, but don't you think there's another very common delusion, which is the ethnicity delusion? Because in my opinion, the way ethnicities exist today, I feel like we can make better ethnicities, because ethnicities today exist just because people lived together for a long time and, created common culture, right? But what if we could create ethnicities based on some common values and common goals in the future? And I feel like people obviously want to form tribes together. There's something in our brains that makes us want to do it. But I feel like some ways of forming tribes are better than others. And is it possible to also ask one question to Alex?
I think we'd rather have just one at a time, and
okay.
especially nobody's paid to see me here,
Yeah,
so
no worries.
see me afterwards, perhaps.
No worries.
Well, the tendency to tribalism is a very interesting quality of humans, and I think one of the things we're seeing now is that the tribalism doesn't only apply to ethnicity; it can apply to opinion, and we tend to be dividing into what look horribly like warring tribes in political opinion at the moment. So I completely agree with you about ethnicity, but I think you were also making the point about tribalism, and that's the maybe this is part of the effect of the internet, is to divide us into warring tribes, where the opinions that we hold are often not based upon evidence, but instead are based upon the tribe to which we think we belong, whether it's Republicans, Democrats, or whatever it is.
As I was saying, like, some ways of forming tribes I feel like are better than others. Like, some have purpose,
yes.
some are just
I think
accidents.
that maybe next question, maybe.
Thank you. It's a shame we don't have more time, I'm afraid, but we want to get to as many as we can.
Thank you, Professor. Hi. I'm an elementary school teacher, and I teach science as a part of my core curriculum. I've often found that phenomenon, like the moth example you gave me earlier, is a great way of teaching students how to engage and look at the world. What advice would you have for me or other educators in continuing to keep that innate sense of wonder and interest in students?
Yes, Alex asked me what question I hate most, and I think I said, I forgot to say the "what advice would you give" question. as though I was some kind of guru. I don't know. I mean, you're a science teacher. I applaud you as a science teacher. Of the sounds as though you're going about the right way. Just be honest and don't stand for nonsense. Do you have a problem with children of creationist parents?
Yeah, I work in a very religious community. I often get pushback on, oh, you're teaching my child anti this, that, or the other.
And is your career, would your career be endangered if you teach something that the parents object to?
No, there's strong job protections for me as a teacher, so that's nice, but...
Well, that's good, because I've heard from other teachers that they actually do have to watch what they say, because the children will go home, complain to their parents, and then complain to the head teacher, who then has the biology teacher up on the carpet and tells them not to offend the pupils. Well, I think pupils need to be offended in some circumstances. It does them good.
Thank you. Thank you for your service.
Good evening, Richard. I'm an atheist, just like you. So it did confuse me when you referred to Christianity as fundamentally decent. My question to you is this. Christianity has a deep track record of inspiring hate and countless other human rights violations and atrocities. So what do you attribute that to, if not the fundamentals? And whatever your answer is, why do you not allow that same leniency to Islam?
Well, I think certainly Christianity in the past has an appalling record, and not that long ago, but certainly in medieval times, Christianity had an appalling record. But it's just that nowadays Islam is somewhat worse, that's all. I mean, Christians don't throw gay people off high buildings, they don't impose a death penalty for apostasy, they don't kill women for the crime of being raped, which is what you get in places where Islam has sway over the government or the people.
But my question was about the fundamentals. You said it's fundamentally decent. And what do you think caused the things in the past that you find horrible about Christianity? If it wasn't the fundamentals, what was it? An
absolute faith that what you believe is correct, not because it's based upon evidence, but because it's handed down by tradition, by revelation, by faith. I mean, faith is a great evil. Faith is belief in something which has no evidence in its favor. And if you have faith in something, then it's impossible to argue against it. And that's fundamentally what the problem has always been with the evils of religion. That's why it's possible for religions to persecute heretics, which they've done throughout the ages.
Would you say that Christianity is a fundamentally decent religion?
Only by comparison with Islam.
Yeah, hi, good evening. First of all, you could add me to your list of people you're meeting on this tour whose lives has been changed by your writing. In my case, it was The Blind Watchmaker, I think 1986. I haven't been the same since. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
My question about education, I was pleased to hear about the Institute for Teachers, Evolutionary Science. What about religion, in the sense that I was brought up Catholic, elementary school, high school, until I realized that everybody else had different religions and they all believed theirs was the true one, and then it just all sort of puffed away. Now my children and grandchildren know nothing about religion because they've been to just public schools. So we sort of have this bipolar kind of situation. Are there countries where this is done correctly, where children learn about the world's religions and how they develop, what they have in common, what they don't? And because without understanding religion, that's part of our species.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think that's what I said earlier, that we ought to be educating children in religion. It's part of, as you say, it's part of the history of our species. And you can't understand the history of warfare. So many wars have been based on religion, for example. And also, as I said before, to understand the literature, you need to be educated. in religion. What is evil is teaching children what to believe, because that's the tradition in which their families have always believed. And
anywhere in the world in sort of a reasonable way that you know of?
I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me, but I'm not an expert in such things. I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for being here. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the legacy of the late Daniel Dennett, maybe your favorite idea of his.
He was a wonderful man. I looked up to him as a kind of elder brother. He was actually a year younger than me, but I sort of, I thought of him as a sort of go-to person to sort out muddled thinking. He was witty, he was wise, wonderful friend. What are his best ideas? Well, he wrote so much. I mean, the philosophy of mind, evolution, his idea of intuition pumps. He's just a wonderful thinker, an example of, to me, a justification of the existence of philosophy. I mean, he was, if ever I needed to be persuaded that philosophers were a good thing, Daniel Dennett was the reason.
You hear a lot these days about life having meaning and life having purpose, and I don't think it needs to be the case, and I wondered just what your opinion was on life having to have meaning or purpose, people have a purpose.
Well, I think that life is a very good thing if you do have meaning and purpose in your life. I certainly do myself. What is wrong, I think, is to think that there has to be a purpose in everything, and there are people who say things like, well, I understand the how of the universe, but what's the why? What's the purpose of it? What's the meaning of it? And that, I think, has no answer. There's no reason why there should be a purpose in any particular. There's no purpose in the universe, there's no purpose in mountains, there's no purpose in earthquakes. They just happen for the reason that they happen, and the laws of physics dictate that they happen. But in terms of our own lives, we have purposes, and our brains are made by natural selection to set up purposes, and we all have purposes all the time, and our life has meaning because we give it meaning. And different people have different meanings in their life, but I think it's one of the glories of being human that we can have meaning in our lives, which rises above the more basic meaning that life has, which is simply to propagate your DNA.
Hi, I grew up in the Czech Republic. I moved here 2 years ago, and I've watched you since middle school, and I never thought I'd get the chance to see you live, so I just want to say thank you for doing this tour. My question is, in recent years, we've seen a rise in cosmetic procedures, many of which haven't been observed in terms of long-term effects. As an evolutionary biologist, what are your thoughts on how the prevalence of these procedures might influence human development and evolution?
I missed the key word. Procedures, what was the key word before?
Cosmetic procedures.
Cosmetic.
Cosmetic?
Cosmetic procedures.
Like what?
Like,
I'm just...
like BBLs, for example.
Like what?
Things like Botox.
Like Botox.
Sorry?
Like Botox.
Oh, Botox.
Yeah.
I don't think I have any views on it. What did you apply this to evolution in some way?
Yeah, I mean, people are going under the knife, changing the way that they look. I think it is relevant to evolution, or can be, which is why I'm asking you the question, because,
well,
I mean...
yes, it's not strictly relevant, because, of course, it's a non-genetic procedure, and so it's I suppose it's just an extreme generalization of wearing clothes and having hairstyles and things like that, in the sense that it's actually surgical. But I don't think an evolutionist has any particular insights about it. And if you're asking me for an opinion about it, I think I'll shrink from that. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here, Mr. Dawkins. The thesis of your book is that we can look at a species today and infer the circumstances of its ancestors. And my question is whether this principle or approach can be applied to memes, particularly the meme of belief in God. Given that theistic religions have popped up and independently emerged all around the world and across diverse cultures, not unlike some examples of convergent evolution, what do you think are the fundamental elements of the human environment or human circumstances that consistently give rise to this meme of believing in a God?
Yes, I'm sure you're right that it is something that crops up all over the world in all different cultures. I don't think it's that surprising. It's probably partly arises from a natural curiosity that people have why they exist, why the world exists, what it's all about. I mean, it's a virtue to have this curiosity, and before science was able to answer such questions, people tended to gravitate towards animism, towards seeing motivation in everything. So instead of just accepting that earthquakes and tornadoes and floods and fires, forest fires and things were products of the laws of physics, they tended to see agency in them. It was natural to do that, and so you tended to get fire gods and river gods and flood gods and earthquake gods. And then these, perhaps in some cases, tended to coalesce and become monotheistic. I think that from a psychological point of view, it's not difficult to see why all over the world you get convergence on not convergence in the sense of detail, because all religions tend to be different, but tendency to resort to agency kinds of explanations instead of natural explanations.
I'm a huge fan of both of you. Mr. Dawkins, I know you've spoken about time as a physical quality of space, and Alex, I know you've spoken to Dr. Craig about the Kalam, and he uses the term sans time. How do you go about explaining to people this concept that there is no before time?
I think you just had this out with Piers Morgan, didn't you? This question of what came before the Big Bang.
Physicists, at least I think most physicists, will say that time began in the Big Bang, and therefore there is no meaning to be attached to the word before when it applies to the Big Bang. I am not a physicist, and there are probably some good physicists in this audience, and I wouldn't presume to attempt to explain why it is that physicists say this, but I think it's one of those things where we have to say our common sense is not necessarily going to give rise to, going to do it. And it's very clear if you read a book about relativity or quantum theory that common sense just is out of it. I mean, you can't use common sense. And so when physicists tell me that in their models time began at an instant, which they call the Big Bang, I have to submit gracefully and humbly and say it's not my subject.
It's the helpful analogy of the North Pole thing, right? So like if you ask wherever you are on Earth, you can keep going more and more north, but if you got to the North Pole and asked what's north of that, you've misunderstood either the concept of north or the concept of the North Pole, and perhaps asking what came before the Big Bang is similar. And so using Dr. Craig's term of sans time is probably more appropriate there. But it's worth pointing out as well that this is a problem for the theist as well. When Professor Dawkins argued with Piers Morgan about this, well, how can you're an atheist, you have to think that, you have to answer what came before the Big Bang. That doesn't make sense. The theist also believes that God is spaceless and timeless, and so creating the universe with time as one of its properties, they still have to run into this problem of explaining what came before the beginning of time. And so I don't think it's a problem that's unique to this side of the house, as it were.
Thank you for being here, Professor Dawkins and Mr. O'Connor. My cousin and I were here together. We're both evolutionary theists, but we've always appreciated your candor and really enjoyed listening to what you both have to say. My question is, we just came from Francis Ford Coppola's very strange new movie, Megalopolis, and one of the premises of that movie is that human friendliness and cooperation is foremost among the driving forces behind human flourishing as a species, and I wonder what your opinion is on that.
It may be true. I haven't seen the film concerned. I think it's probably true that human friendliness is a major factor. It's not obviously very Darwinian, and I think we might have to invoke a little bit of departure from strict Darwinism to explain the extremes of human friendliness, things like giving to charity, donating blood, that sort of thing, which I think a strict Darwinian, a naive Darwinian would have a hard time explaining things like that. And I think that it comes under the heading of emergent properties of the human species, which have taken us above and beyond our Darwinian heritage. We're placed in the world by Darwinian natural selection, but our brains have gone further. And so we are perhaps more charitable, friendlier than strict Darwinism would have us be. And I'm delighted by that.
Thank you.
By the way, we're getting near the end here. I wanted to say before the Q&A finishes that if you have a VIP meet and greet ticket, then when the event ends, stay in your seats. Everybody else will leave. Stay in your seats, and you will be told what to do shortly afterwards. If you haven't already picked up your copy of the Genetic Book of the Dead, go and do that at that point, and then return to your seats. And for those who are not VIP meet and greet ticket holders, the Genetic Book of the Dead will also be for sale at the merch stand.
Good evening, Richard and Alex. So I have a question that I've seen so many religious people raise, and this is somewhat hard for me to answer, so I would like to get a response from you. And they point out how scientists, we also have like a set of assumptions or axioms that we cannot prove, and we just take them for granted in order for the science, just based on pure faith. So they claim that we just have a different set of axioms, and they have a different one, so we have just different faiths, but we're faithful at the bottom. So how would you respond to that?
You're saying that even scientists have axioms which they just have to...
Yeah, I was so the axioms that I'm referring is, for instance, the uniformity of nature, the intelligibility of the universe, or the laws of logic.
Could you talk more slowly?
Yeah, like how we can, like the laws of logic, we just take them for granted, we cannot prove them, or the uniformity of nature, that is that the laws of the universe apply in the past, in the future, and that is just an assumption that we take for granted, but we cannot prove that, so it's like a sort of faith, isn't it?
Let's take one of those, the laws of logic, for example.
The
laws of logic.
Yes.
Which seem foundational to even get going with science. They seem to be things that your brain just thinks are true and can't think are false. It seems like something that can't be proved. So do we not have a level of faith at the basis of the scientific enterprise?
Yes. I suppose 2 + 2 = 4. Is that a matter of faith? Is that what's the kind of thing we're talking about?
Or something like the idea that the laws of physics will continue working in the future, things that we can't necessarily prove, even things perhaps like the existence of the external world and the idea that there are other minds and you're not just sort of in a computer simulation, things which, strictly speaking, you can't prove that that's the case. So is there not some allowed faith in your worldview and some disallowed faith?
Yes, I mean, well, other minds. I mean, the belief that other people have a consciousness analogous to my own. I know I have a consciousness of myself, but how do I know that you do? And I suppose that comes from the feeling that we've come into the world by the same route. We've evolved in the same way. We both were born and we had a childhood and so on, the same way. So solipsism, it can't be disproved, but solipsism, the belief that I'm the only person who exists and all the rest of you are figments of my imagination. Bertrand Russell once got a letter from a woman who said, "Dear Lord Russell, I'm so pleased to hear you're a solipsist. There are so few of us around these days." I suppose that there is a... Thank God I'm not a philosopher, that's all I can say.
I think we've probably got time for just this last one. I'm so sorry everyone else who's queuing up. I suppose this always has to happen at some point, but we're just out of time, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Dear Richard Dawkins, thank you for all the work that you've done. Some people living with schizophrenia, like myself, can experience gods speaking to them that seem more real than just simple hallucinations. Do you think psychotic experiences such as these have played a role in shaping religion or constructing religious narratives?
This is a question for Alex, I think. I mean...
Actually, the timer is... it's flashing.
Well, I mean, it has been said that certain religious visionaries, like St. Paul, like Muhammad, may have been schizophrenic or may have had some psychological condition like that. It wouldn't surprise me. Also, I suspect that certain hallucinogenic drug states might lead to religious experiences. And I once underwent an experiment of putting a helmet on my head, a man in Canada who claimed to give people religious experiences by passing magnetic fields through the skull. It didn't work for me. I was flown there by the BBC who wanted to see if I had a religious conversion, and it was a control experiment, not a very good control experiment. They had a vicar there, and he underwent the same experience, and he vigorously denied that it had any effect on him. I'm not quite sure why. I'd have thought he'd enjoyed it, but anyway, it had no effect on me. I was just a poor subject. I've never tried a hallucinogenic drug. Maybe one day I will.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. As I say, if you have a VIP meet and greet ticket, just stay in your seats or go and pick up your book if you haven't already. For the rest of you, please join me once again in thanking, again for the last time, Professor Richard Dawkins.
Thank you. Thank you.
That was great. Thanks so much. Fiction. Oh, I think we're doing a...